Okay. I think yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Great. Nobody watches this right away, right? Anyway. Hey, welcome to History Chats. Definitely prepared here. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes here. As you can see, this is the topic for today. It's the Wisconsin Railroad map, and specifically, we're looking at sort of a mystery here of Taiseux City, which is kind of an anomaly and led me on an interesting journey. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk about wrap up March MAPness here. We've been doing a lot of fun stories about maps here in Marathon County, and the stories that either we can see that explain the map, or in this case, what we're going to do is talk about a map that informed a story. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you hang out here we're going to start about a minute or two here. If you're watching after the fact, feel free to skip ahead about 2 minutes, and that'll get you to the thing if you want. Or stick around and hear about some upcoming stuff, because this weekend we're having our first actual back in-person History Speaks event. So this is going to be on the topic of William Jennings Bryan, who was a very notable politician in American history, although maybe not as well known these days. Probably one of the few people from this era that you might have heard of. And definitely an interesting guy. And he did come to Wausau maybe once or twice. We'll find out all about that coming up, this Saturday. So again, that'll be the first in-person event, but we will be doing it as a stream as well, so you don't have to come in. You can always watch it later. But if you want to come by the museum and see people again and talk history, we'd love to have you. That's 2 o'clock this Saturday. And while we're talking about History Speaks stuff, later in April, we're going to be doing a talk about the Wausau Group. So many of you, if you're watching this, may be somewhat familiar with the concept of the Wausau Group. These guys who were important, leaders in the community. But we're gonna Eric Konup, our curator of the Yawkey House, he's been doing quite a bit of research to try to untangle this story and find out exactly, okay, who are these people and what's their story? So that'll be a good one too. That'll be later. That's April 23rd, also at 2 p.m. on Saturday. Okay. But today we're talking about, so we're talking about maps today, as we have all month. For whatever reason, today is the last day of March. So we just barely got in another one. We have 5 actual maps to talk about this year in March MAPness, as opposed to 4 from last year. So thankfully we got one more. Tomorrow's April 1st, but today is March, the last day of March, so we get one more here. And this is the map that we're going to talk about, and specifically a very interesting story associated with it. So I'm going to bring up a better scan here so we can kind of zoom around a little bit. This is the map. So it's a railroad map. It was produced for the Railroad Commission in 1883. It's got some interesting stuff here. If we look down at the key, get a little bit bigger here. So interestingly, different companies, different lines got different colors. I don't know that this is more orange to red. I don't know if that's a scanning or aging thing, but the rest of them are pretty close. And then notably, there's this projected roads distinguished thus with dotted lines. So if we zoom over to Marathon County, which is, after all, what we're talking about here, you can see pretty clearly the dotted lines here of the projected railroads. Didn't quite follow this in the end, but we do already, and this is 1883, so we'd only really had railroads connected to Wausau for about a decade, little under. But the yellow one, of course, here, that had been established back in the early 1870s, and there's some more. And what's really interesting about this map, the reason that I really like it is, in some ways, we see a lot of communities on here, right? Beans Eddy. Knowlton's there. We still have a Knowlton, but we don't really have a Beans Eddy, as far as I know, or Gray's Prairie Switch. There's some Clayton, Hatley, sure, yeah, Weston. But there's a lot of places here that show the lost maybe potential. You know, the railroads were coming in. It looks like a community is going to grow, but not all of these ended up sticking around forever. You know, Mansville down here, or Manville as it is noted here. Well, the one that we're interested in here is this one, Taiseux City, or Taiseux probably. Clearly it's a French word. It's got that EUX, which is a kind of a giveaway there. Taiseux, although as is the case in many Wisconsin place names, maybe it was called something else. I don't know how you pronounce it necessarily. Oh, hold on. I'm just going to make sure that. Yeah. So you know, pronunciations can kind of go out of the way sometimes, but yeah. Anyway, gets back to the presentation here. This is the map that we're looking at, of course. Sorry, I'm a little distracted just a second here. Making sure that I have this stuff working. Good. Okay. All right, back to the map. So what is this? And you know, what do we learn? What's really interesting is that if you look at, there's the railroad map of 1883. So if we look 1882, the county had a plat map. So this is township 30 north and then 7 and 8 east. I kind of photoshopped them together so we can get a full sense of it. And so this is the Wisconsin River. I got the Trap River coming off of it. This is the area here. It's a little busy, so I went through and I removed some of the extraneous letters to just give us what we're looking at. There's a station here, the railroad, right? The dotted line, I guess, here. Not dotted, the black and white alternating thing. And then you have Trap City. And what's interesting is that is probably what most people would expect that place to be called. Trap. Maybe with one P, sometimes it's two, sometimes there's an E on the end, but whatever it is, the Trap River then gives the name to the community that's there on where the Trap River empties into the Wisconsin. That's the way it is on municipal lists. It's the way it is on, you know, so many election rolls and you know, plat maps and stuff like that. And yet, in 1883, and maybe other ones that I you know, wasn't able to find, apparently they called it Taiseux or whatever, you know, they call that. So what's the story then? Well, part of the story actually comes, you know, this is an issue here of the Wisconsin Lumberman. Very interesting. This is the first issue. They published from 1873 to 1875. It's published in Stevens Point, actually. And as the thing said, it's devoted to the lumbering interests of the state of Wisconsin. And so this is a thing where they would have explanations of here's what's going on, here's what the news is, different sort of industry stuff, but also to explain it to wider people who might need to know things about lumbering. And they also had an index, basically, that showed, like, here are the major players in the lumber industry at these locations. What's interesting is in April of 1875, and I probably should put that issue up instead, but I kind of like the first one here. It featured a little article that mentioned something about a guy named Mathieu de Courcy. He's a French-Canadian gentleman who had come here. Back in the 1860s, he had actually been this county superintendent of schools. Although, actually, interesting fun fact, he was actually the you know, not counting deaths or resignations or anything like that, the shortest term that a county superintendent ever had, because after he was elected on a political election, they decided, well, we should probably have this at the nonpartisans, which is the off year. So his 2-year term was cut to 1, and then somebody else took over. But anyway, so he's involved in the superintendent of schools. He and his family are definitely involved in the area. And he was kind of probably best known for being the lumberman. Again, from the Wisconsin Lumberman, that directory, we can see here, M. de Courcy. Probably just went by Matt Courcy. Again, we kind of tend to, you know, Americanize the names, but there he is on the Trap River. M&D meant manufacturing and distribution, I think. Manufacturing. So what did this article talk about? So the actual article itself is something along the lines of, and I should have written down the specific title, but I thought I would remember it. Something about, like, the working with railroads. You know, how can lumbermen, grow their communities by working with the lumber industry or the railroads, right? It mentioned that kind of in a sort of a paragraph, just talking as an example, mentioned De Courcy as being a guy who had worked with, kind of been approached by a gentleman from Milwaukee, Hastings, Charles Hastings. And together, they recognize that, there's potential here. Railroads going in means that the land around the railroads, particularly if there's a depot there or a station of some sort, would probably indicate that there would be people coming. So if we could kind of pave the road, and specifically, there's a lot of railroads being built in the 1870s and 1880s. So if we can give ours an edge, maybe we name it something different. Maybe we don't just name it, Trap, because that's not very an enticing name for settlers to settle in the Trap City. So maybe you want something different. In the Town of Texas handbook, this is the town that today is in this area, right? They have, they published it in 1976 for the American Bicentennial, but it is a really look at the history. And so, for example, here on page 78, this is the section where they're talking about family farms and who lived where and all that stuff. And the Kurth farm here, which is actually started as the Bergman farm. I don't know if you can read this, so I'm gonna read the first paragraph here. The Kurth farm was a homestead acquired by Jerome and Coraline Bergman in 1878. They came from Switzerland with their daughters that same year. And from the moment his train arrived at the Taiseux depot, it spelled Taissex, so slightly off. That's probably why I didn't come across this earlier in the spelling search. Anyway, from the moment he got at the depot to his death, Jerome was known as a natural and honest farmer. And then it says that he died in 1902, and then his daughters married Lawrence Kurth, and then they took over the farm, and that's why it's called the Kurth farm. So, and then it goes on and talks about additions and all of the family members in kind of typical style for this. But this is really interesting, because here they have the usage of the word Taiseux. Well, sort of, spelled a little off, but it's close enough, right? And that indicates that they came here, and maybe because of that. But they're Swiss, which is interesting. Or are they? This is the 1900 census. This is a page, I definitely you probably can't see this very well, but this is the town of Texas in 1900. And it lists them as, they had immigrated from Switzerland to the United States in, and I don't know if it's here, but one of the other censuses mentions this, November of 1877. But what's interesting is they actually were both born in France and married in Besançon, or Besançon. Sorry, I know I was saying it wrong, and I just looked up this pronunciation, but something along those lines, in France in 1869. So this begs an interesting question. This is the city, Besançon, here, and Bern, Switzerland is just right over the border. So that's not the typical immigrant journey. You generally don't go further inland into a landlocked country in order to then go to the United States. So what's the story there? Well, it has to do with the Franco-Prussian War and some other stuff that's going to come out of it. This is an opportunity that I thought, oh, cool. When I was in grad school, I was the Tolkien European scholar. I kind of had a focus on Europe. I don't get to talk about European history very often, so I was excited, and then I realized I can't go on too long. So a very brief overview. If you're not familiar, at this point in 1870, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon III, is the nephew of the big Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy from the Emperor, right? Well, he actually crowned himself emperor again, and so we're in the Second French Empire. And in 1870, they are basically challenged by Otto von Bismarck in Prussia, who's the head of basically the guy in charge of the North German Confederation. There's not a Germany at this point necessarily. There's a region, but there's a lot of little states. So you have Prussia, which is kind of the big here. The red is the North German Confederation, but there's still the southern Germans. The kingdoms of Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, they didn't really want to join in, but they had a mutual defense agreement, right? So if anybody declares war on the northern Germans, they would come to their aid, but they weren't going to get involved any further. So what Otto von Bismarck does is he takes a pretense of getting involved in the Spanish election or the throne. Right? He says, I want this candidate, the succession should go this way. And he basically was a challenge to Louis Napoleon saying, if you have a problem with this, you should declare war on us. And Louis Napoleon, consulting his advisors, said, no, yeah, we got the best army. We're going to win. If you go to war, we'll win it. So he declares war on Bismarck and the Prussians. So the North Germans come to their aid, and so do the Southern Germans. And it doesn't go well for the French. They were sorely mistaken about the situation. And ultimately, by the end of 1870, Louis Napoleon, the Emperor of France, is even captured at battle. So in his place, the government of France says, well, we got to figure out a way to go without the emperor. You know, you can't have an empire without an emperor. And so they create the Third Republic. And so they're going to have elections, and eventually they elect Adolphe Thiers to be the new president, and he's going to be the one that signs a peace deal with the Prussians, which is not great for the French. You know, lots of payments. It's a real prestige hit to their, you know, the French. They also lose some territory along the Alsace-Lorraine territories. And ultimately, this is going to be the event that solidifies, finally, the German people, and within short order, the German state is going to be created. But as that transition happens from empire to republic, the communists in Paris, who have been working very hard to radicalize the working people living there, they rise up. They see a power vacuum, and they see this opportunity to create. I don't want to get too deep into like the history and the explanation of communism, although that's very interesting. Notably, not the same, you know, communism, socialism, like the stuff that's happening at this point. You know, it's changed a lot since then, so it's not necessarily the same thing as what you see today. But it's not even what it was when it first kind of got started. The main thing here is, so the communists basically want a society. They see the inequalities of classes, right? The working class doesn't really have much. They struggle to make a decent living, whereas the people in charge and the upper classes, they don't have to worry about that. Not to say that they, you know, don't have problems or that they can't be, you know, happy or successful or what have you, as a, you know, in either case. But indeed, ideally, communism is all about, like, we should try to get to a point where everybody is the same, in the sense that everybody can be happy, has the same ability to be happy and successful. And you shouldn't just, you know, based off where you were born and to who, that decides your fate. The problem being that it's hard to get to that point because there's all these people that are already have power, you know, the nobility, the church, all of these people who have a vested interest in not letting that happen. And so for the communists, seeing this and coming to this assumption, they decide, well, we need to take power. And so particularly in France, they're following a guy named Blanqui, who's not present. He's actually in prison by the French government at this point. But his philosophy is basically, hey, if we have to take violent action in order to seize power and put a dictatorship in charge in order to get things moving, we'll do that. And they do. And so as the siege of Paris is happening by the Germans, the Parisians rise up and they create a commune. Which is basically just mean communist, communard is what they would call it. And they end up basically ruling for about 2 months until it all falls apart. Fascinating story. Highly recommend you go look into it if this is interesting. It's a whole thing. But anyway, it's not the only city that does this. There's a bunch of other communard cities. Paris, Lyon, Saint-Étienne, Marseille, and Besançon. And a couple other cities. And in each of these cities, there's similar attempts. Like a local ruling government was put in power by the communists, and then it falls apart. And what ends up happening is the leaders get, you know, put in prison, they get executed or exiled. But there's a lot of people who are just sort of along for the ride. You know, if you're just a working class person who gets swept up in the moment, the communists may not have the most proven plan for success, but at least they're trying to address, you know, the working class's problems in a radical way. So it's way to, you know, many people just get swept up in the moment, and I think that's what probably happened to the Bergmans or the Bergmans, and now that we know that they're French, because if they were from Besançon, it's very close to Switzerland. And actually, that communist uprising tried to use Switzerland as a supply base. So there's that connection there. And so if they're just working class people who got swept up in the moment, but now are fearing for their lives, you know, maybe go somewhere else. This leads to a few years later, after Thiers is the next elections, Patrice Mahon, I'm not sure exactly the pronunciation. My 7 years of French is failing me in this moment here. But anyway, he takes over, right? So, and in sort of an off-the-cuff speech that gets transcribed, he says this: the state has not forgotten her misled children, whom have left France, those quieted exiles who may only wish to live without fear of persecution. There remain still some places in this world outside of France, and should they have abandoned the teachings of those radical communards, we hope that they can find a future elsewhere. Perhaps in America, which is kind of an interesting jab to throw in there, apparently. This gets translated and actually sent around, republished in places, particularly because this is the first time that the government of France, Macron and even Thiers were pretty conservative. And so they're saying, yes, we want to, punish the leaders of the revolution, the communes, but also we recognize there are people who weren't actively involved and just kind of got swept up in the moment. And for those people, we don't want you back in France. Don't come home because, you made your choice. But that doesn't mean you can't be happy. And if you can find a home, and as long as you're not, making trouble for whoever that is, we're not going to come after you. And the important thing is here, this phrase, the quieted exiles or the silent exiles, if you translate that into French, les Taiseux, right? So heading back to Wisconsin, while this all connects here, in Wisconsin, Hastings and de Courcy, who are aware of things, and they would have been know the German immigration started with the failed revolutions of 1848 and how the intellectual leaders who, now were facing prosecution in the German states came to places like Milwaukee. And so when the Germans then continued to come to the New World, they settled in places where there are already Germans. So if people are trying to attract, French exiles, again, not the leaders, but the silent, why not? I think this is ultimately what that article talks about is, hey, let's try to attract them by giving them, a name that'll attract these people. And it's interesting, some of these people end up coming here, right? Like the Bergmans, like I alluded to. But I think what's interesting is the impact. We'll talk about who actually takes them up on this in just a second. But if you look into the future, 15, 20 years later, they don't really radically change the population. There's not a lot of them. But if we look at, for example, the voter tally for the 1892 presidential election, this is the area that they're from. And just to kind of put this in context, these are the three candidates, leading candidates for the presidential office: Republican, Democrat, and populist, sort of left-leaning, sort of even further left-leaning. This is that township. Compare this to the rest of the county's split. It's this. That to me says that maybe there's some lingering, at least sentiment. To be clear, I don't think anybody was settling in the Trap River area, fomenting revolution, trying to, seize the means of production or whatever those, the communist teachings. But I think they carried over a lot of the things, and perhaps to the Bergmans. And I say the Bergmans specifically because again, I didn't know anything about this until I was trying to, pulling this thread, and that led me to their daughter, Lorianne, who is the one who marries Lawrence Kurth and takes over the farm. It turns out that she actually was elected to be as far as I can tell, the first woman on a town board in 1886, when the township around that community gets formed for the first time. And there's a saying here, but she seems to have actually been kind of involved in an important decision of what are you going to call it? What do we name this? And so she apparently said, well, we came here because of the Taiseux. Didn't end up staying that way. There's still a lot of Germans in the area. So they, particularly, northern Germans. So they don't really like the idea of having a very French word. Also, it's probably good because it's kind of hard to pronounce. But like Texas is an American word. Let's use Texas. And so apparently this is how the name comes from. Well, here, let me let her explain it in her own words, though. Oh, well, that's also true. Okay, so this is a moment where I have to come clean. So last year, History Chats ended up falling on a April Fool's Day. This year, it's tomorrow. But I know a lot of people end up watching the day afterwards, so I figured, if nothing else, let's do it again, and maybe people won't see it coming. So for those of you who have been maybe listening to, knowledgeable about, the railroads or town of Texas, and you're sitting there going, "What? This isn't correct." Yeah, I made a lot of this up. Starting with the map itself. This is the map, right, that I got, and this is what it actually is. So I did Photoshop the name. It's actually Trap City. It was always Trap City in that area. So there you go. Consequently, though, and this is true, this is actually accurate. I didn't change anything here except to make it easier to see. It was Trap, right, in the 1880s. This did exist. This is an actual very cool resource if you're interested in lumber history from the mid-1870s. But of course, they never ran any issues. And in fact, the last issue is March of 1875. So when I said that there was an article in the April edition of 1875, maybe they were going to make one, but no, there was never even edition of it as far as I can tell. So that didn't happen. Matthew de Courcy is not actually Matthew de Courcy. He's Matthew D. Courcy. It's just a Yankee name, but it sounded like one that could be, this is real. He actually was here. He actually was school superintendent for the shortest amount of time. That was just a fun discovery that came across. I do also have to note, this is not actually Matt de Courcy. In fact, this is a guy named Charles Helke. I just found I needed a picture, and so he looked like he was not one of the people that you immediately recognize, so, and of the time. Bergman Farm is also not exactly true. Bergamot is actually, I just kind of went bergamot. That's kind of, the citrus that you, like, for example, in Earl Grey tea, that sort of citrus flavor, that's bergamot. But it sounds like something that could be Americanized or Germanified in the context there. But this doesn't actually happen. This is on the right is the actual page from this book that they did. And I photoshopped in a completely false narrative. The Kurths are a farm in the area. It's actually on the next page. But I thought, hey, let's do that. Consequently, Jerome and Coraline Bergman don't exist. There, in fact, is no, this is just a random page from the town of Texas in 1900. So this is real, but it just actually has nothing to do with the story I was telling you about, except being in Texas. So therefore, they didn't immigrate from Switzerland, although there are some Swiss that settled in Marathon County, not a huge, and certainly not French coming through Switzerland. I think most of the Swiss ended up coming from like the German side, as opposed to the French side, but either way. But this is true. This is where those places are. And everything I talked about that happened in Europe pretty much is accurate. The whole context for the Franco-Prussian War, that's true. The Third Republic taking over, and the Paris Commune taking over. This is actual something that happened. Very interesting. However, even though there were other, and similarly, there were, forgot I mirrored my camera. There are other cities that did that too, and this is true. However, this whole statement is incorrect. This is something that I wrote up. I tried originally to turn it into write something in English and then try to translate it and then back to give it sort of that off sense that you sometimes give with translations. But yeah, that was a little too odd. So I just wrote this basically so that I could include the Taiseux, because this translates to the silent in French. And so that was the basics for all of that. So getting back to this then, why Taiseux? Well, I thought it kind of might be an explanation for why Texas, because Texas is kind of a weird name for a township. And, it's kind of feasible that maybe stuff gets flipped around, right? It's kind of close. In the Town of Texas book, they do have an explanation for where the name comes from. And this is part of the reason that I decided to do this whole story. because their explanation is thus, I think quoting somebody else writing in 1912 by the looks of this, but they said that originally the town of Texas was the largest township in Marathon County, thus it was named Texas, which is kind of stupid. To be honest, I don't think that, I mean, for one, this is not actually, like, this is the site, when town of Texas was created in 1885, actually here, on our website, I made this last year for for one of our talks here, where you can actually go through and see the development of the communities, the townships. And if we get to the actually, went past it. It's actually 1858, so I kind of moved it back 30 years. But yeah, you can see here, town of Texas is not the biggest county, even though it does go up probably quite a ways. It's not the largest in the county. So I don't know why they decided to call that. The reason that I think it probably was called that, if I had to give an explanation, it has to do with oh, you know what? I just realized that doesn't work out. I was under the assumption that it was the town of Maine, which is right across the way, which they might have been calling that area Maine. There's a guy living there, spelled M-A-I-N-E. That was the surname. And I just assumed that Maine was the farthest northeast state at that point in the Union, and Texas was the southeast, or southwest. So I thought maybe that was kind of thing. I don't actually know. So there you go. I don't know if that's a fun fact, but some discrepancy there of why we call the town of Texas. And I should say, this may be accurate. I don't really know. I can't find any backing except this statement, so hard to know. Finally, unfortunately, Lorianne Bergman Kurth does not exist. This is just a random unidentified picture that I found in our archives and kind of fit the time. Therefore, she was not elected to the town of Texas board. I don't know when the first woman, I couldn't find that was, but I'm guessing probably well into the 20th century, just the way things are. So there's April Fools. Yeah, I don't know. Thought it'd be kind of fun. Hopefully you enjoyed this. You know, it's always an interesting challenge because to do one of these, you kind of have to make it feasible enough. And so you still go through the same process of, okay, where would I find that story? Oh, maybe this lumber magazine that was published for a few years. Well, let's work with that. So it's still kind of an interesting process. I enjoyed putting it together. Hopefully you enjoyed watching it. With that in mind, I'm going to bridge to the transition of what we're doing next month, or next week. We're actually going to kind of keep it going with April Fool's Month. Now, all of these stories are going to be, I'm not going to make anything up from this point forward. We're going to go back to real history, but we're going to talk about some of the misconceptions, the quacks, the hoaxes, the misunderstandings, the myths, you know, that are a part of our collective history for the county. So we're going to, next week, for example, we're going to be talking about a traveling quack doctor named Dr. Turbin. I'm very interested in putting that together and sharing that with you next week. But there's other stuff we're going to talk about, the trolleys that never existed but actually existed in postcards. More on that later. What actually those tunnels are for, and the truth about Prohibition that are, you know, because, you know, we like to say that there's tunnels underneath the streets of Wausau. People like to ask us about that. But we're going to talk about what actually happened during Prohibition. And then we'll have a little opportunity to talk about some of the cryptids, the monsters and beasts of the pinery that, you know, were made up years ago and maybe have been forgotten, but some interesting stories there. So that's the program. Let me just check to see if we have any questions or anything. Some comments. Okay, so there is a Beans Eddie. Interesting. John had commented on Facebook. Yeah, Beans Eddie. I'm sure that it was a place. It's just not something you usually see on maps, which is very, very cool. Yeah. And then, yeah, I have a sense of humor. Well, thank you. I'm glad, John, Ron, that you feel that way. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed that. Anyway, it's about an hour, half an hour now, so I think I'm going to maybe leave it there. Again, hopefully you enjoyed the diversion into a what if alternate history type deal here. We'll be back to the hard history next week. And again, just to remind you all, if you're looking for something to do this weekend, Paul Clark from the Wausau East High School History Department is going to be doing, he always does a great presentation. He'll be doing our first History Speaks. So again, that'll be on same place you're watching this, or you can come on to the museum itself and sit down and hear it in person. Either way, yeah, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next week for some more foolish stories in April.